Let us ask you something. Would you believe if we told you Africa is about to shake up the world? Yeah, Africa. The same continent that's been overlooked and underestimated for centuries. And it's not doing it alone. It's teaming up with BRICS. You've probably heard of them, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and many new nations are on the line to join. Together, they're flipping the global script in a way that's making the old powers nervous. Sounds wild, doesn't it? Well, stick around.
And staying with the president, the commander-in-chief has threatened the BRIC nations with 100% tariffs for trying to replace the U.S. dollar as the dominant currency in global trade. In a social media post, President Trump stood against de-dollarization, saying Washington needs a commitment that these countries would neither create a BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the dollar. Trump also added that if BRICS nations want to use another currency, they can say hello to tariffs.
Like 6 of them, and they were trying to destroy our dollar. They were going to say, you know, they wanted to create a new currency. They probably wanted to use the yuan. China, they wanted to use the yuan. And Biden said, well, this is a tough situation. There's not much we can do about that. We can't help that. I said, oh, we can help it. So when I came in, the first thing I said is any BRIC state that even mentions the destruction of the dollar will be charged a 150% tariff. And we don't want your goods. We don't want to partake. And the BRIC states just broke up. I don't know what the hell happened to them. We haven't heard from the BRIC states lately. But he said that there wasn't much we could do about it. There was a lot. It took once, literally. They said, sir, what about the BRIC states? They're going to take over the dollar, the sanctity of the dollar. They're going to create a new currency to rule the world.
Africa seems to be a geographically quite remote continent, but a continent close to us by its spirit, because Africa is home to very courageous, freedom-loving countries that value their sovereignty and, relying on it, make, and we are sure, will make other decisions in the interests of their peoples and their countries. And in this sense, Africa is a reliable partner.
Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the global power map has been redrawn quietly, strategically, and without a single shot fired. Washington certainly didn't expect it, but that's exactly what just happened. While the West was busy assuming that Africa would remain a supplier of raw materials and a follower of foreign interests, Africa was quietly rewriting the entire script, and the country helping Africa do it wasn't who anyone predicted. For the first time in modern geopolitical history, Africa and Russia have aligned their economic engines, resource networks, and security strategies into a partnership strong enough to challenge decades of Western dominance. This isn't aid. This isn't charity. This is a full-scale recalibration of global power, and it is hitting the U.S. harder than anyone expected, because the West's biggest mistake was believing Africa had no alternatives. They thought Africa would always rely on Western banks, Western companies, Western militaries, and Western trade routes. But the moment Africa linked its mineral wealth, agricultural capacity, and strategic geography with Russia's technology, energy supply, and global networks, something historic happened. Africa became untouchable. Suddenly, major resources that once flowed cheaply to Europe and the US are being redirected through new routes. New financial systems are bypassing Western control. New industrial corridors are emerging across the continent, and the West, accustomed to calling the shots, is watching its influence collapse in real time. Washington is stunned because the shift didn't begin with confrontation. It began with cooperation. Africa needed a partner that respected sovereignty. Russia needed new markets and stable alliances. Together, the two built something the West never believed could exist, an independent power bloc capable of rewriting global trade rules from the ground up. And here's the part that terrifies the U.S. the most. The alliances spreading from this partnership are multiplying. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, and South America are taking notes and joining in. The world is moving away from Western dominance, not because it wants conflict, but because Africa has proven that a new system is possible. This is not just an economic shift. It's not just geopolitical. It's a rebirth of global power centered in a continent the West underestimated for centuries. The question now isn't whether the U.S. can stop it. The real question is whether the world even wants the old system back.
The G20 summit is making history in Johannesburg this year, a big achievement for host South Africa.
Because this is the very first time that a social summit of the G20 is being held on African soil. and you can applaud yourself.
For the first time in a century, we actually have an economic competitor called China. We never had that. Soviet Union was not an economic competitor. It was way too poor, way too small. Even today, the American GDP is $28-29 trillion. Russian GDP, $3 trillion. This is David and Goliath, but David minus the slingshot. They have military, they have nuclear weapons.
Degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too. So anybody that's in BRICS is getting a 10% charge.
Is that immediate, sir? Or
Yeah,
is that
pretty soon.
if they engage in some behavior?
Well, if they're a member of BRICS, they're going to have to pay 10% tariff just for that one thing. And they won't be a member long. I thought BRICS was, I said this about a year ago, and it largely broke up. But, there are a couple that hang around, but I thought it largely broke up. BRICS is not, in my opinion, not a serious threat. But what they're trying to do is destroy the dollar so that another country can take over and be the standard. And we're not going to lose the standard at any time. If you have a smart president, you will never lose the standard. If you have a stupid president like the last one, you would lose the standard. You wouldn't have the dollar as you. And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country any longer. We're not going to let that happen. The dollar, you ever hear the expression, dollar is king? The dollar is king. We're going to keep it that way, okay? And I'm just saying, if people want to challenge it, they can, but they're going to have to pay a big price.
The world had grown used to the familiar rhythm of global power, Washington giving directions, Europe echoing them, and the rest of the world adapting to survive. For decades, the balance never truly shifted, no matter how loudly nations complained or how forcefully they tried to redefine their independence. Yet beneath the surface, Africa and Russia had been moving quietly, step by step, forming a partnership that most analysts dismissed as temporary, symbolic, or simply impossible. What no one realized was that these two regions were about to pull a lever so powerful, so unexpected, that it would shake the foundation of global politics. In a single stroke, it started with intensifying pressure from Washington. The U.S. had imposed fresh restrictions on energy traders connected to Russia and quietly introduced new conditions on African governments seeking access to American markets. The message was clear: choose America or lose America, but the world had changed. Africa was no longer the continent begging for access. It was the continent holding the supply keys to cobalt, manganese, uranium, platinum, rare earths, and new shipping corridors the world desperately needed. Russia, on the other hand, controlled energy routes that kept entire continents alive through winter. Both regions understood the same thing: the old power structure was not only outdated but suffocating. So when Russia reached out to Africa with a proposal, a unified trade corridor that bypassed all Western checkpoints, African nations didn't hesitate. The deal promised something they had rarely been offered by global powers: equality, not charity, not dependency. A seat at the table, not a request to wait outside the door. When the announcement came from Moscow and Addis Ababa, the world didn't immediately believe it. They assumed it was another symbolic alliance, another diplomatic handshake that meant little. They were wrong. The first major shift was subtle but devastating. A large coalition of African nations declared a new mineral policy that prohibited unprocessed mineral exports, two countries enforcing economic pressure on their partners. Since the U.S. stood at the top of that list, American tech companies, renewable energy manufacturers, battery developers, and defense contractors suddenly found themselves locked out of supply chains they had assumed they controlled. At first, Washington dismissed the policy as posturing. They believed Africa would reverse the decision under economic pressure. They underestimated how deeply African nations had coordinated with Russia behind closed doors. What the U.S. didn't know was that Russia had already stepped in with new processing plants, rail systems, and long-term energy guarantees. Africa didn't need American investors anymore. It had found a partner who didn't fear challenging the global order. And the moment Africa announced the policy, Russia activated the second phase of their strategy, redirecting major energy exports to African ports under new pricing agreements, allowing Africa to supply Europe on its own terms while simultaneously strengthening its negotiation power. The ripple effect hit Washington like a thunderstorm. U.S. officials watched as global commodity charts flashed red. Processors in California shut down production lines. Mining companies started sending urgent requests to the government for new diplomatic solutions. The aviation sector, heavily dependent on rare earths, began predicting billions in losses. Global markets panicked when reports confirmed that nearly a third of the minerals destined for the U.S. had already been rerouted to Russia's industrial network. It wasn't symbolic anymore. It was real, immediate, and irreversible. Then came the move no one expected. Russia and Africa jointly announced a new payment system designed to completely bypass the dollar. It wasn't based on digital experiments or unstable currencies. It was backed by actual resources: gold from South Africa, oil from Algeria and Angola, gas from Russia, and mineral reserves from Congo, Zambia, Namibia, and Tanzania overnight. Dozens of nations expressed interest in joining. Suddenly, the world had a new economic pole, something powerful enough to weaken the dollar's dominance for the first time in nearly a century. Washington's response was swift but ineffective. Officials issued warnings, announced sanctions, and attempted to pressure European allies to take action. But Europe, already struggling under energy costs and desperate for new suppliers, saw the Russian-African partnership as an opportunity rather than a threat. European factories, still recovering from previous crises, quietly signed long-term agreements with African and Russian suppliers. Even major Middle Eastern economies signaled their support. In just 3 months, U.S. influence in global markets shrank more than it had in decades. Inside Washington, panic turned into disbelief. Economic advisors predicted severe long-term shifts if the new Russian-African system continued to expand. Reports revealed that U.S. companies would face shortages, higher production costs, and increasing dependency on nations that no longer feared American retaliation. Meanwhile, in Africa, infrastructure projects accelerated faster than ever. Russia funded new pipelines, power grids, rail networks stretching from East Africa to the Atlantic, and major mineral processing zones. African governments, for the first time in modern history, felt they were writing the rules rather than obeying them. The partnership was not built on charity. It was built on strategy, leverage, and mutual interest. By the time Washington realized the scale of what had happened, it was too late. The global center of gravity had shifted not loudly, not explosively, but with quiet precision. Africa and Russia had executed a strategy so well coordinated that even analysts called it the most unexpected geopolitical realignment of the century. The United States, once confident in its uncontested leadership, now faced a world where countries were no longer afraid to challenge its authority, and as global markets adjusted too. The new reality, one truth became impossible to deny. Africa and Russia had just triggered a power shift the U.S. never saw coming. The shockwaves from the Russian-African alliance were still spreading when a second blow hit the global system, one far deeper and more disruptive than the first. What began as a trade partnership evolved into a coordinated restructuring of strategic industries. And this time, Africa and Russia were not just bypassing the West, they were replacing it. As global markets scrambled to understand the new order, Africa quietly launched a massive industrial push. Backed by Russian financing, engineering expertise, and long-term energy guarantees, African nations transformed themselves from exporters of raw materials into producers of finished goods. The West, accustomed to dictating the manufacturing pipelines, was suddenly watching Africa do something they had once insisted was impossible: rebuilding entire industries that had been intentionally suppressed during the colonial era. The first factories opened in East Africa, processing rare earth minerals into components for electric vehicles and high-performance electronics. Instead of shipping unprocessed ores to Europe and the US, Africa now exported precision-engineered components directly to Asia, the Middle East, and South America. Russia provided advanced refining technologies, and African governments ensured that the profits stayed within the continent. The West had no counter-strategy. Decades of dependency had left Western companies without alternative suppliers. In southern Africa, new energy infrastructure powered by Russian technology created industrial corridors that fundamentally reshaped regional economies. These zones produced high-grade steel, aerospace components, medical equipment, and even advanced agricultural machinery. With affordable Russian energy flowing into the continent, and with new ports along the Atlantic and Indian coasts, Africa became a manufacturing powerhouse overnight. U.S. corporations were stunned as contracts worth billions evaporated. For years, they had relied on the assumption that Africa had no choice but to export its wealth at basement prices. But now, with Russia providing the missing technological link and with African nations asserting their sovereignty, the old model was dead. The United States found itself locked out of markets it once dominated with ease. What worried Washington most was not the economic pain, it was the speed. Africa and Russia moved like nations that had studied the global system for decades and had waited for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment was now, when the world was exhausted from previous economic crises and hungry for new partners who could deliver stability. The next disruption came from West Africa, where a new maritime strategy reshaped global shipping lanes. With Russian support, Africa established secure ocean corridors linking the Gulf of Guinea. the Atlantic Fast Route, and the Red Sea Economic Pathway. These routes made trade more efficient and crucially reduced reliance on ports controlled by Western-aligned powers. Suddenly, African ports became preferred hubs for transcontinental logistics. Massive cargo ships from Asia rerouted their journeys, choosing African coastal cities over Western ones, accelerating the economic rise of the continent and further isolating the U.S. from key global trade flows. The West tried to respond with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and warnings of global instability, but none of it worked. African governments saw these moves for what they were, attempts to reassert a control structure that no longer had legitimacy. Sanctions only accelerated the shift, forcing Africa and Russia to deepen their interdependence, while pushing neutral countries to rethink their alliances. Europe felt the pressure first. For years, its industries had depended on cheap resources from Africa and affordable energy from Russia. Now both supplies were redirected or priced according to a new Africa-Russia coordinated system. Factories across Europe cut production, energy bills soared, automotive giants delayed new product releases, and agricultural producers faced shortages of fertilizers and metals. European leaders, frustrated and desperate, attempted emergency negotiations with African blocs. But Africa, with Russian backing, stood firm. The era of Europe dictating terms was over. The era of Africa choosing its partners had begun. In global finance, the consequences were equally dramatic. The new commodity-backed payment system, introduced by Russia and Africa, gained rapid adoption among emerging economies. Countries tired of dollar politics saw the alliance as a chance to escape U.S. financial pressure. With gold, energy, and mineral reserves guaranteeing transactions, the system offered something rare in geopolitics: stability outside Western influence. As more nations joined, the dollar's influence slowly eroded. Washington attempted to downplay the shift, calling it temporary turbulence, but internal reports told a different story. Analysts warned that losing access to African minerals and Russian energy would raise production costs across the entire American economy. Consumer prices rose. Tech companies projected weaker revenues. Agriculture, heavily reliant on foreign fertilizers, faced higher costs. The U.S. had never imagined facing a world where Africa and Russia dictated the terms of global trade. The political class began to fracture, with some demanding aggressive countermeasures and others insisting that Washington negotiate from a position of humility, a position the country had rarely taken on the global stage. Meanwhile, Africa was experiencing something unseen in centuries: unity driven not by external pressure but by strategic purpose. Russia took no leadership role. It acted as a partner, respecting the sovereignty of each nation. African nations coordinated production, trade, shipping, and infrastructure in ways that shocked even the most optimistic analysts. The partnership was no longer about resisting the West. It was about designing a new world where economic power was distributed more equally. The symbolic moment that confirmed the shift came during a major global summit. Representatives from dozens of countries gathered not in Washington, not in Brussels, not in Paris, but in an African capital. There, Africa and Russia announced a global development initiative offering energy partnerships, mineral processing training, and manufacturing agreements to nations seeking independence from Western institutions. The message was unmistakable. The era of Western-led globalization was closing, and a multipolar world was emerging, led by regions that once stood on the margins. As the summit broadcast reached Washington, the reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage. Yet behind closed doors, American strategists admitted the truth: the U.S. had been blindsided. Africa and Russia had executed a geopolitical realignment so unexpected, so coordinated, that it rewired global power dynamics without firing a shot. The shift was no longer theoretical, it was reality. The world had changed, and the United States was no longer at its center. The turning point came when the alliance unveiled its most ambitious project yet: a continent-wide resource consolidation strategy. Africa, coordinating with Russian experts in logistics, finance, and industrial engineering, reorganized its mineral and energy sectors into regional blocs that operated not as fragmented states but as unified suppliers. This single shift shattered the foundation upon which Western economic power had been built. For decades, Western companies exploited Africa's divisions. They played one country against another, negotiated uneven contracts, and maintained monopoly control over mineral pricing. But almost overnight, the new African blocs changed the rules. Rare earth minerals, cobalt, gold, platinum, natural gas, agricultural inputs, and industrial metals were now priced according to African terms. Contracts were renegotiated, export thresholds were enforced, local value addition became mandatory. And all transactions flowed through a financial system engineered jointly with Russia, one designed specifically to bypass Western influence. European and American corporations panicked as their supply chains unraveled. Without access to cheap African inputs, production costs in the West surged, industries that depended on African minerals from electric vehicles to aerospace to pharmaceuticals faced unprecedented shortages. Western governments accused Africa of economic aggression, but Africa responded with calm clarity. The era of extraction without accountability was over. At the core of the alliance's strength was the stability provided by Russia. Unlike Western powers, Russia did not attempt to control Africa's political decisions or enforce ideological conditions. Instead, it offered something Africa had long been denied: sovereignty backed by material power. Russian infrastructure specialists built high-capacity rail networks connecting mineral fields to African ports. Russian cybersecurity units protected African digital systems from external interference. Energy shipments flowed consistently, fortifying African manufacturing clusters that once suffered from chronic power shortages. In return, Africa gave Russia something equally valuable: access to markets that had previously been monopolized by Western corporations. African agriculture fed Russian cities. African minerals fueled Russian factories. New African ports became gateways through which Russian goods reached Latin America and the Middle East. The alliance was not built on dependency but on complementarity, and this balance terrified Western strategists who had never imagined a world where Africa could choose its partners instead of being assigned them. The U.S. tried to counter the shift with emergency trade incentives, promises of renewed partnerships, and even military-aligned initiatives disguised as development programs. But African nations refused to be lured back into old patterns. They remembered decades of broken promises, aid packages that never materialized, trade agreements that benefited the West more than the continent, and political manipulation disguised as cooperation. Now that alternatives existed, Africa saw no reason to return to a system that had kept it at the bottom of global power rankings. The decisive moment came when Africa and Russia announced a global commodities exchange, headquartered on African soil. Unlike Western exchanges, which allowed speculators to manipulate prices, the new system tied mineral and energy valuation to real-world demand and production capacity. This stabilized prices for developing nations while undermining Western financial institutions accustomed to profiting from volatility. When the first major transaction on the exchange involved a multi-billion-dollar sale of refined African lithium to an Asian tech giant with payments processed through the Africa-Russia financial network shockwaves rippled through global markets, the US dollar suffered immediate pressure. European currencies struggled to maintain value. Western analysts warned that the world was entering a post-Western economic era, one in which Africa and Russia were no longer participants but architects. The political fallout was even greater. Nations in South America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia publicly praised the Africa-Russia partnership. Some requested observer status. In the alliance, others sought direct membership. A global reordering was taking shape, one that rejected centralized Western power in favor of distributed influence across emerging regions. Washington, unable to comprehend how rapidly the world was changing, called for urgent summits with Asian partners. But the response was lukewarm. Many Asian countries had already deepened their engagement with Africa and saw no benefit in choosing sides. The old structure where nations aligned with the U.S. to gain access to capital or protection was fading. Africa and Russia had proven that powerful alternatives could exist. Meanwhile, Africa focused on internal transformation. New industrial hubs rose across the continent. Agricultural zones powered by Russian technology replaced outdated systems reliant on Western fertilizers and machinery. Ports equipped with advanced Russian logistics. Software became some of the busiest in the world. African universities launched research partnerships with Russian institutions, producing engineers, scientists, and economists trained not for extraction models but for value creation industries. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not exporting talent, it was importing it. The cultural consequences were profound. African media began producing content showcasing the continent's rising industries, modern infrastructure, and technological achievements. Narratives shifted from dependency to dominance, from victimhood to agency. Across the continent, young people saw a future where Africa was not a resource pit but a global industrial giant. The West, still clinging to outdated assumptions, failed to understand the deeper meaning of the shift. This was not merely a trade realignment, it was a psychological revolution. Africa was building confidence, unity, and ambition at scales never seen before, and Russia's consistent support amplified that confidence. The U.S., unable to halt the momentum, experienced political fractures. Businesses pressured lawmakers to restore access to African markets. Politicians blamed each other for allowing the U.S. to lose ground. Think tanks produced reports warning that the Africa-Russia partnership represented the greatest geopolitical shift of the century. But Africa moved forward without hesitation. With Russia by its side, the continent established new defense agreements, new scientific alliances, and new cultural exchanges. It was no longer reacting to global events, it was shaping them. And as more nations aligned with the Africa-Russia model, Western dominance continued to erode. By the end of the year, global analysts had reached a conclusion once considered unthinkable. The center of gravity in world affairs had shifted. Power no longer flowed solely from Washington, London, or Brussels. It now flowed from African capitals connected by Russian networks, African ports powered by Russian technology, and African markets integrated into a global system that no longer required Western approval. The old world had relied on Africa's weakness. The new world depended on Africa's strength. And in that strength, Africa and Russia found not just partnership but destiny.